Well, it's 9 o'clock, so I think we'll get started and people can jump on as they like. And it seems like we have the same faces each time, but just in case you don't know who I am, I'm Deirdre Cassidy. I'm the program manager for Met How at Home. And we thank Bill Hottell for another session 7, right, Bill?
Yeah, that's right.
Black American History in the U.S. Thank you again for Met How Arts for sponsoring. And Emily, can we see your beautiful face with mask? Oh, you have a new mask. Thank you, Emily, the behind the scenes lady. Again, if you want the best experience, you're going to want to put it on the speaker view. Jim will be taking our questions at the end. So just put your questions down there in the little chat. And if everybody would please mute themselves, we'll get started. Great. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Deirdre. Deirdre mentioned during this, if you have questions or comments, you can always write them into the chat feature during the session. So we'll have a couple of questions ready at the end. Reviewing what we did last week. We did 2 topics last week. First one was in Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, it was the extraordinary coup d'etat, an overthrow, a violent overthrow of the city government. Eventually it spread to the whole state of North Carolina. The legitimately elected officials of Wilmington, there were whites and blacks both on the city council and in important positions in the city. And the white supremacists planned out carefully and violently overthrew the government. Many blacks were killed in the streets of Wilmington. And one thing I described was the newspaper. Well, I have a correction to make. I mentioned that the Daily Record, the newspaper whose office was burned and totally destroyed. I mentioned that it was the only black daily newspaper in the country. Well, a correction, an alert member of our group informed me that there was another there's a black-owned newspaper, daily newspaper, called the Seattle Republic. It was operating from 1894 to 1918. So for that, we are indebted to Steve Oyen. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Steve. And then the second half of the session last week, we went to sugar plantations. We learned how much expertise and skill was required to operate a sugar plantation, and also how dangerous, how hazardous it was, especially operating the sugarcane crushing mill and the boiler house. Okay, what is the theme for today? It is slave revolts. Slave revolts. So we're going to visit 3, 2 of them are famous, 3 slave revolts, one in Louisiana in 1811. And this is one that we did not learn about in school. And I'll tell you why a bit later. Secondly, the Great Slave Rebellion in Haiti, which was successful, became an independent country run by the former slaves. And thirdly, the Nat Turner slave revolt in Virginia. We're quite familiar with that one, but it's extremely important, the most important slave revolt in the United States history. So we'll be visiting those 3. So for the first one, we're going to go to the slide, see the picture of, try again. This is a picture of the plantation manor. It's called the Destrehan Plantation. Just north of New Orleans. It's on the Mississippi River. It was owned by Manuel Andre. And there was an extraordinary uprising, which we never heard about for 200 years. To look at the map here, the map of Louisiana, this plantation of Manuel Andre was just on the Mississippi River, just about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans. So if you look at the map, you see New Orleans down in the lower right-hand corner, most important city in Louisiana. On the mouth, just above the estuary. So you go about 40 miles up the Mississippi River, you get to this plantation. Now, last week we learned plenty about the sugar plantations, like the sugar cane grinding mill you see here, and the boiling house. That's the second building on the right, where that delicate process of boiling the sugar cane juice had to be done 24 hours after the harvest. So all of that was part of this the process at this sugar mill right here. This is one sugar. So all of that went on this plantation right here. This is Andre, there's Manuel Andre's sugar plantation. Now the uprising, the rebellion, took place in 1811. It's quite early and pretty early in sugarcane production history in Louisiana. So what happened at the uprising, it was organized and carried off after dark, November of 1811, and the slaves had gathered all the weapons they could, namely axes, machetes, sugarcane knives, and they stormed into the manor house. What is that squeak sound? Yeah.
Ask everybody to mute themselves.
Okay, there's a loud squeaking sound. Be sure that you have.
There's a loud squeaking sound. Be sure that the loud squeaking.
Can everybody mute yourself? Can everybody mute yourself, please? If everybody's muted, we won't hear any cacophony. Okay, so the slaves, again, at this plantation, they stormed into the manor house and totally surprised the owner, Manuel Andre, in his bed. They came in with their weapons. Manuel himself was able to escape, but the rest of his family were all killed.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
Okay,
Sorry, one moment.
we're going to pause a moment and try to cure the.
It appears that everybody is muted. Oh, wait, Peter.
Somebody's
Deidre, it's BRB, it's BRWV. BRWV, whenever he goes off mute, we get feedback.
It's QAnon.
Feedback on Bill's end.
It's definitely QAnon.
Okay.
I think
Storm
it's,
the antlers.
it looks like Charlene Burns is not muted. I'm gonna
I know,
mute.
because
Oh, it's John Hawley.
Ah, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, that should be better.
Thank you, John, for muting. Okay, to continue. We see the manor house here at Manuel Andre's plantation. So the slaves poured into the manor house, killed the entire family except for Andre himself. He was able to slip out. But Manuel, before he escaped, he noticed he could see who the leader, the organizer of the slave revolt was, and it was Charles Delon. Somebody's still not. John, are you muted? I hope. Anyway, the leader of the rebellion was Charles Delon. He was the most trusted overseer, the manager of the slave operation, the most trusted, the most favored overseer, and he was the leader of the rebellion. The plantation owner was horrified and in disbelief, but the rest of us are not surprised. So having taken over this plantation, the slaves seized more weapons, horses, and militia uniforms, and they started marching toward New Orleans. Again, this is 40 miles up the Mississippi River from New Orleans. And they continued burning houses, burning plantation manors, and killed another plantation owner. And the rebels, historians have not been able to discern the exact number, but as many as 500 slaves may have been involved in this rebellion. And finally, they marauded for 48 They marauded for about 48 hours. And finally, there was a pitched battle of other plantation owners and militia. And then of course, the whites had much better weapons, firearms. So they finally subdued this, the rebellion and killed or captured nearly all of the slaves. We're going to take a look at the map again. And so you find New Orleans down in the lower right-hand corner. And so this small army of slaves were marching down the Mississippi. But once they were vanquished, their bodies were mutilated and their heads were cut off and placed on the top of poles right along the Mississippi River. And this was first observed by a Mississippi riverboat. If you look behind my head, you could see 3 of the Mississippi side wheelers, riverboats. A riverboat of passengers was coming down the Mississippi, and they saw the most ghastly scene. Along the bank was a pole with the black head of a slave on top of it. That was horrifying. And then they went around the bend, and there was another pole with another decapitated head of a slave on the pole. And as the boat chunked along toward New Orleans, head after head after head told everybody that there had been a slave uprising and that this was a reminder of what happens if the slaves dare to rebel. Now, how do we, I mentioned that this story was not known for 200 years. Nobody, I mentioned that this is one of the stories of Black history that we did not learn in school. It was almost exactly 200 years later, no, it was a little more than that, that a graduate student at Harvard University was interested in, started pursuing Black history, and he noticed only in 2 or 3 footnotes that there was reference to an uprising, a slave rebellion on this Andre's plantation. And so he pursued it, and the story had gotten no notoriety whatsoever. And he was shocked to find out this amazing story. And so he finally, his research ended in this book called American Uprising, the Untold Story of America's Largest Slave Revolt. His name is Daniel Rasmussen, graduate student at Harvard University. Now, we're going to bring up to date the story of sugar production. And here's a National Geographic magazine of August 2013, it was 7 years ago. And this is a story of sugar and why we can't resist it. It's quite fascinating. A lot more research has been done about sugar, about the merits of sugar. Example, between 1973 and 2010, 30 some years, the number of the cases of diabetes leapt from 2% to 7%. That's an extraordinary jump. That's millions of Americans who contracted diabetes, who developed diabetes. And today, so what is the legacy of sugar is, let's go on. Here is cotton candy, 100% sugar, irresistible at carnivals. So here's another picture. This is all candy. And I've learned that the Americans have spent $30 billion a year on candy. $30 billion a year. And sugar provides calories with no nutritional value. So if you want to add up your calories with no nutritional value, here's how you do it. Mainline some candy and other sugar products. This picture shows breakfast cereal. Every one of these breakfast cereals, and there's dozens, I think there's something like a couple hundred different types of sugar-coated breakfast cereal. Sugar-coated. And a scientist, well, the American Heart Association warns that consuming excessive amounts of sugar is not just empty of calories, but it's actually toxic. Dr. Robert Lustig at the University of California, San Francisco, has established that sugar is poison. Sugar by itself, when consumed in high quantities, is toxic. It is poison. So what is the legacy of? The legacy of sugar is heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and obesity. So what we've just done, we've gone from the sugar plantation to obesity. And America is approaching, we haven't made it yet, approaching 50% of the entire population are either obese or approaching obesity right now. So it's a national catastrophe. An interesting, this cupcake, I have pictures here to illustrate something. In the year 2000, that's 21 years ago, there was a cupcake craze that swept the country. And how it happened was fascinating. The television series, Sex and the City, one of the stars was Carrie Bradshaw. And in this scene, she was nibbling on a cupcake. It was a pink buttercream cupcake. And that one episode of seeing this attractive star munching on a cupcake started a cupcake craze. And one result was December the 15th is now National Cupcake Day. So be sure to observe that. Have a couple dozen cupcakes on December the 15th. Now, an interesting follow-up observation on our reaction to sugar is Calvin and Hobbes. And I love this picture right here. Here's Calvin. He says, every Saturday, I get up at 6 and eat 3 bowls of crunchy sugar bombs. Sugar bombs. You gotta love Bill Watterson. He's a genius. Here's another comic strip. Hobbes is saying, what's that cereal you're eating? He says, my new favorite, chocolate frosted sugar bombs. Have a taste. Thank you. Yay, sweet. Calvin, actually, they're kind of bland until you scoop sugar on them. So here is a box of sugar bombs. So that is to bring us up to date with the effects of sugar. It begins with the ugly labor of the slaves on the sugar plantations, Louisiana in this case, and the final result. Okay, next, now we're so much for the plantation of Louisiana. Now we're going over to Haiti. Now this map of southern states and the entire Caribbean is to illustrate Haiti. It's almost right in the center. To the right, where you see Cuba right in the center of the map, just go to the right, the next big map, Hispaniola. It's got 2 countries today. Haiti is the left, the 2/3 to the right is the Dominican Republic. The original name of Haiti was Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue, that was the Christian name when it was settled by French plantation owners, French sugar planters. And Haiti was ideal territory for sugar planting. Now this is the slave rebellion in Haiti, which was the only successful slave revolt on a vast scale. The entire country became independent. Although the slave revolt took about 10 years. It was a long, bloody, drawn out battle. Now this is not, Haiti is not, did not take place in the United States, but there was a huge influence of the Haiti Rebellion. It exercised, had a huge influence on Black history in America. Now here, this picture is a market in the capital, Fort-de-France in Haiti. The population is approximately 100% Black today. It's also, unfortunately, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, now, what was the big influence on Black history? I'm going to go to the bottom line right away, clue you in. First of all, Napoleon. Finally, Napoleon. This map is especially good. It's a geophysical map of the island of Hispaniola. Napoleon. Oh, this is Toussaint Louverture, the fabulous leader who organized the rebellion. And finally, after several years, Napoleon Bonaparte, in this portrait, decided the only way to crush it, it was a small military force there that could not suppress the rebellion for years. So Napoleon decided there's only one way to really crush the resistance, and that was to send a large military detachment. So a large army of French soldiers were sent to Haiti to snuff out this rebellion. Well, it didn't work for two reasons. Haiti was decimated by guerrilla warfare. Toussaint's army, he was able to train 4,000 troops into a very effective army. So the French army was battered by guerrilla tactics. And the second enemy was yellow fever. That's the one thing that most destroyed Napoleon's army. And so how did Napoleon respond? He got so frustrated that he decided to just dump Haiti and forget it. And in fact, to abandon his whole vision of a French empire in the Americas. Now, that made it possible for, when he decided to sell Louisiana, of course, to the young United States. And that made it possible for African-American slaves in Louisiana to pioneer sugar plantations in Louisiana and Arkansas and West Texas. Now this map shows the revolt began on the north coast of Haiti. And that's where Toussaint Louverture, he was just one slave on a single plantation. But it began with drum beats in the night. There was, as was common among the Black communities, they held ritual gatherings after dark. The voodoo gatherings, or Diana and I actually attended one of the voodoo gatherings when we were staying in Haiti. After dark, in many areas, you hear the drum beat starting up. So that's the way it began. And then on this one plantation, the slaves rose up, stormed the manor house, killed all the whites, and then this began. It spread across the north coast of Haiti. So
Uh-oh. Sounds like Bill is frozen. I will send a text to Emily. Sorry about that. Station identification. This is Met Out Home. Okay, I'm going to call Emily. Can you all hear me? You just nod.
Yeah, hear you.
Okay. Looks like we lost him for a minute. Sorry about that. Good old technology. I did text Emily and I haven't heard back from her. So maybe just get a cup of tea, go to the bathroom.
There we go.
hello, Deirdre.
Oh, there we are. Yay.
Okay, we're
I
back.
was thinking I was going to have to entertain everybody for a while.
Our apologies for the gap. It was not human error. That was a technological breakdown.
Who knows?
Yeah.
No worries.
Okay, to continue, now we're looking at the geophysical map of Haiti. So Toussaint Louverture was an extraordinary leader of men. He also discovered he had a real talent as a military commander. So he started training the troops in guerrilla tactics, guerrilla tactics. And so he had eventually formed a very effective army of 4,000 people. Oh, okay. Very good. Now this mosquito, this is not the Anopheles mosquito that spreads malaria, although they existed there. This is the Aedes aegypti, the Egyptian mosquito. Ironically, it was brought to Haiti by slaves on the Middle Passage because it hadn't been at least active in West Africa. But once you were once you were bitten by the Egyptian mosquito, you usually died in 3 days. It was a very painful and bloody death. So anyway, getting back to Toussaint Louverture, his army, in the first 2 months, they were able to they killed 200 white settlers, French. They destroyed 180 sugar plantations. They also destroyed 900 small towns associated with coffee plantations and indigo plantations. So the next picture. Now, okay, now jump in, stand back and look at the big picture. Look at what's happening in Europe at the same time. This is a fascinating cross connection. Just the same time that Napoleon Bonaparte had sent his sizable army to Haiti, at the same time, Napoleon was just beginning his conquests of Europe, from France here, first of all down into northern Italy. By that time, by the late 1790s, he was recognized as a military genius, and he never lost a battle. He was extraordinary. So he expanded French territory into Italy, then into the Germanies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and on toward Russia. So Napoleon, at the same time that he was finding his army was being destroyed in Haiti, principally by yellow fever, he could not spare any more soldiers to send to Haiti. Obviously, so he just decided to abandon Haiti and count it off as a loss. Now this next map shows this is Central Europe. It shows many of the German states, all of which were conquered by Napoleon, including the Empire of Austria and the several states down in Italy and heading toward Hungary and Russia. So here's Napoleon as he's heading east across and conquering all of Eastern Europe and Spain, same time. Okay, the next, we're back to, this is the map of the Caribbean. So what was happening, the white planters, French, the ones that had some foresight, got out of Haiti as fast as they could, but so many stayed because the southern part of Haiti was still not occupied by the rebellion. But every year, more and more plantation owners left the country. A few could take their slaves with them, their skilled sugar producing slaves. Now the big question, we've got to get out of Haiti. So where can we go to continue our sugar production? Some went east to the Lesser Antilles, the Leeward Islands, Windward Islands like Martinique, Guadeloupe, Marie Galante. But many others were saying, now where is a place that has the perfect soil, ideal climate for growing sugar to the west, and ideally speak French, where the French language and French culture are dominant. Aha, there is another place, and that is New Orleans and the Louisiana territory. So many packed up their goods or just ran for it, some with their slaves, and they went to the port of New Orleans and settled there. And up this next picture shows French territory, all of that green in the center of the continent, everything west of the Mississippi and the whole Missouri River is French territory before Napoleon sold it to Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, that's all French territory. So the area in southern Louisiana was ideal for sugarcane. So this begins a movement, and immediately other American pioneers poured in about the same time, and a huge number of slaves there. The number of slaves in Louisiana in a period of 20 years quadrupled. The number of slaves quadrupled in Louisiana, which showed that there was an extraordinarily boom of sugar planting. So, and the French culture, just a note on the French culture, because the planters from Haiti felt at home. New Orleans was a notable French city. Where does New Orleans get its name? From Old Orleans, Old Orleans in South Central France. St. Louis was a notable French town, a frontier town up the Mississippi. Where did St. Louis get its name? It's named for King Louis IX of France. He was such a noble leader, one of the most beloved French kings. He was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. So it's St. Louis, Missouri, named for this beloved king of France. And the Louisiana territory itself, named for whom? For King Louis XIV of France. So you get the idea that the culture there, language culture is French. Very soon to be overtaken by the American plantation owners from Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, coming down to the sugar rush, like a gold rush into Louisiana. So, as I mentioned, so the African-American slaves in Louisiana were the ones who pioneered, along with some slaves, of course, from Haiti, were the ones who pioneered a whole new chapter in Black history in America. They were so effective, the Black slave pioneers cleared the land, cut down cypress trees, planted sugar, and the economy of Louisiana exploded in volume. And within 5 decades, the enslaved African Americans were producing a quarter of the world's sugar supply. Repeat, within 5 decades, the enslaved African Americans were producing a quarter of the world's sugar supply. It's astonishing boom in the economy, this change in the world's economy. In short, the African Americans, with some help, of course, by the organization skill of the white plantation owners, but largely it was the African Americans who built Louisiana. And of course, you could make a case, the African Americans are the ones who built this country. And the city of New Orleans became the #1 slave market in the country. New Orleans was the Walmart of buying slaves, selling slaves. Now, this is the geophysical map of Haiti. Now, if you were to get a taste of what it was like for the French army, for the French soldiers down in the southern part of Haiti, if you were to visit, so look at the capital, Port-au-Prince. That long peninsula is a mountainous peninsula with thickened jungle, and the French soldiers faced the nightmare here. If you were able to go down and visit the jungles there, which we're going to do right in a minute, put yourself in the place of a French soldier. They're in the jungles being attacked by Haitian guerrilla troops. And the French said, hey, they're coming, they're picking off our soldiers in the rear and on the flanks. This is not fair fighting. This is not the way we fight wars in Europe, in civilized Europe. But the guerrillas were decimating the French army. And at the same time, the real enemy, the worst enemy, was yellow fever. And that's what eventually decimated the French army and actually destroyed, as a fighting force, Napoleon's army was destroyed. So here we're going, this is the capital city of Haiti, Port-au-Prince. We're going to go dive into the jungles and get a taste of what it was like for the French army. This is like the Grand Central Station. If you want to travel in Haiti, you go to this, it's a huge open field. There are about 30 buses. These are trucks converted into buses. Notice this is totally packed with passengers. You've got all kinds of luggage on the roof, everything from bed springs to cages of ducks. So Diane and I, there's no signs that say where the buses are going. So Diane and I walked from one truck driver to another saying, where is this? Are you going down to the south coast? You're going to Jacques Mountain? Say, no, we're going north. They're speaking all in French, in Creole French, by the way. Took a little extra labor. So we finally found a bus that was heading south into the jungles. And here I took this picture. By the way, we were riding on top of the bus. The inside was so crammed with people, there was no room. So Diane and I climbed up on top with some other passengers and surrounded with cardboard boxes and luggage. But this is an extraordinary picture. It shows the highway. This is a main highway. It's a muddy dirt road. And notice we have to cross a river. It was unbelievable. Look at the jungle there, by the way. Picture yourself as a French soldier going through the jungles and being attacked by mosquito, yellow fever carrying mosquitoes and French soldiers and the commandos, the guerrillas. So this is the principal road to the south coast. It's only about 40, 50 miles, but it took 9 hours to get there. And what the bus driver doing here, there's no bridge. We've come to a river. So the bus driver, we drove down into the river, crossed the river and up the other side, muddy bank, and continue on. Well, I started counting the crossings. There were 80 different rivers that we had to cross and not one bridge on this main road from the capital down to the south coast. And by the way, it's some terrible dips in the road, and we had to hang on. And I really felt in place. I felt that it was like riding a Brahma bull in a rodeo, but Diana and I managed to survive. And this next picture shows, look at the muddy road, goes down into the river, and it does not come up on the other side. Here the bus driver, the truck driver, drove down into the river, drove right up the middle, no, driving down the middle of the river for I don't know how far, and then finally a suitable place to come back up on the far side of the river. This was, to me, one of the extraordinary adventures of a lifetime.
Hello.
Hello, Deirdre.
How did
Yes.
it feel?
What was that? What was?
That's not me. Somebody is not muted.
How did it feel? Well, it was. I suppose we were risking our lives, and it was.
What?
But it
You
felt,
know,
it felt like
He's
we
got
were,
a funny. Oops.
okay. My voice clear again. Yeah. Anyway, I like living on the edge sometimes. And this is one of those places where we're definitely living on the edge because the truck was bumping left and right. Finally, after about 9 hours, we come to this extraordinary, beautiful French colonial town of Jacmel on the Caribbean coast. And look, it looks almost exactly like other French colonial towns like New Orleans. This looks exactly like the French Quarter in New Orleans. Looks like other French colonies, Phnom Penh, Cambodia, Hanoi, Algiers. And this is Christmas morning. Look at these handsome young Haitian boys. And it's so warm down there. You notice none of them is wearing any pants at all. The women in the background carrying baskets on their head. And this is a great portrait of a handsome young Haitian boy. It's just beautiful people, even though it's ranked as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, the next. Now here, this is the map of New Orleans. This was the destination of many of the French planters who bailed out of Haiti. And again, I mentioned this became the major slave trading center in the country. So we've seen the connection between Haiti and the beginnings, the pioneer of a sugar plantation in the state of Louisiana. A very important link. Now, the third and final slave revolt in 1831 in Virginia, the Nat Turner slave rebellion. Nat Turner this slave rebellion was probably the most famous of all. There were some 200 rebellions of slaves in the United States, in the English colony, and in the United States, but we'd never heard about most of them. But there's about 4 or 5 that you have heard. The rebellion of Denmark Vesey, for example, which was aborted. But the slave rebellion led by this man, Nat Turner, was historically the most important of all the rebellions. And we'll find out why in a minute. But this is a picture on the cover of National Geographic History magazine. This is not the regular National Geographic, but they have another magazine. It's all history episodes, about 5 or 6 fascinating episodes from history. And I love the magazine. Many people don't even know about it, but it's great. The featured article is Nat Turner pictured here. And this is a scene from a movie. There was a recent movie called The Birth of a Nation. It was 4 years ago, 2016. The Birth of a Nation, not to be confused with the other very famous one, 1915. It was the first big, important movie production in America. It was a totally racist story of the glories of the Ku Klux Klan, the horrors of blacks, set the tone for the prejudiced view of blacks. Anyway, so the movie producer took the same name, Birth of a Nation, and it went through in detail the rebellion of Nat Turner. Now this is a picture from the movie, and Nat Turner was a preacher. He could read, he was very literate, very familiar with the Bible, which he's holding. Here he's holding a church, a religious service in a barn. He was very familiar with the Bible, and he had been planning the slave rebellion for many years. It was not the first slave revolt, but it was this revolution, this revolt stands out from others for its brutality and its impact on American history. And it is a corrective view of who Nat Turner was. It is a contribution to American history. And because he knew the Bible so well, Nat Turner preached that this rebellion, he understood that this rebellion was ordained by God. And that was the message that he sent. And finally, his group, he organized about 70 slaves. Eventually, they added as they marauded through Southampton County in Virginia, the very south of Virginia. And they marauded and killed. They went from one plantation to another. Let's go to the next picture. This map, if you look at the tiny map in the south, Southampton County is on the border of South Carolina, deep south in Virginia. And the group marauded. They finally obtained horses, but they marauded all across this entire county, going from one plantation to another, killing the whites, killing all the whites that they encountered. And the impact, they marauded for 2 days and 2 nights. Finally, plantation owners and militias formed up a small army and finally stopped them, but they had gone back and forth all across the county. And the impact of this rebellion was massive. First of all, it caused panic all over the slaveholding South. Virtually every white in the slave areas of the South went into a panic, of course, of knowing that many farms, many plantations had been raided and the whites slaughtered. Also, as a result of this, the whites went wild, and there were brutal lynchings. Hundreds of blacks were lynched. Also, another result was stricter regulations of both slaves and even freed whites. This next, and Nat Turner himself was not caught at first. He managed to live for 2 more months out in the swamp forest in Southampton County. But finally he was, now this is a contemporary drawing from the view of the whites entitled The Horrid Massacre in Virginia. And you see women and children, and women and children were killed, by the way, also. And the justification, it's still a bit controversial, but the justification was that the white slave owners, of course, were culpable, but their children, some children actually were legal owners of some slaves, and the slaves knew that the children would grow up to be slave owners and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So that was a justification for killing not only the plantation owners, but their wives and children as well. This tree was, when Nat Turner was finally arrested in the woods, he was brought back and hanged from this tree. It's still a historic monument. That was in 1831. He was hanged, and but that wasn't the end of it. His body, he was dismembered, and his head was cut off, and body parts. This was a custom of the time. A custom of the time was for any famous criminal or notorious criminal, for his body parts to be distributed, sold as souvenirs, as keepsakes. And the oral history is quite, the documented history, it describes in great detail the revolt and the massacres, but the oral history tells a couple of things, what happened to Nat Turner's body and where the executed slaves were buried. So oral history tells us that Nat Turner's head was cut off and put on a post. There was an area, again, sound familiar, where there were posts with slaves' heads mounted on top. And that area has been discovered, and actually archaeological digs have started about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. But Nat Turner's skin, some of his skin was made into lampshades and coin purses. And there's one plank with a section of his skin nailed to it that's been privately owned for 185 years. So we're learning more and more about Nat Turner. But the two views of the Nat Turner Rebellion, the white view is that Nat Turner was a religious fanatic and that he was a cold-blooded killer. The blacks have a different view, that Nat Turner was a hero, a leader of a necessary rebellion, making a necessary statement, and that Nat Turner was a freedom fighter, a genuine hero. Another carrier of that message was, if you remember back in 1967, a Pulitzer Prize winning novel by William Styron, The Confessions of Nat Turner, an excellent book, worth reading still, by William Styron. And then the most recent is this movie, The Birth of a Nation. It's a corrective on the history of who Nat Turner was, who and what he was. Now this is a grain field right beside a road, and the oral history of the slaves, and notice the sign, the road sign, it says Blackhead Signpost. The oral history has established, been extraordinarily accurate, established where many of the rebellious slaves were buried. And there are no grave markers here, no headstones. It was swept under the carpet where the rebellious slaves were buried, but right here where we're standing in this field. And so the family, by the way, here is, I thought I had a picture of, anyway, Bruce, I was going to show a picture of Bruce Turner, a direct descendant of Nat Turner. So he does have family there, and they and other blacks have been lobbying for archaeologists to start digging where the blacks remember, passed down generation by generation. And so archaeologists began about 5 years ago. And there were no clues except the black memory. And sure enough, they have found these are human bones, and they're just the archaeological digs are going on at this moment. They're finding more. They've found another place where those rebellious slaves were buried. It was right at the hanging tree we saw a minute ago. So we're just finishing the story of Nat Turner and his rebellion, the most important slave rebellion in American history. So what we've done, we visited 3 slave rebellions. And I know that many of us have, who was telling me yesterday, that many of us feel as you go through 2.5 centuries of African-American slavery, why didn't the slaves rise up and just kill the whites more often? Well, the system was so effectively orchestrated by the whites, but they still, nonetheless, there were as many as 200 slave rebellions, which proves that the slaves were continuously thinking and dreaming of a day of freedom. So we visited Manuel Audrey's sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the slaves marched toward New Orleans, but they were all rounded up and executed. Then the famous slave rebellion in Haiti, how that affected American history and the peopling, the pioneering of Louisiana. And finally, the slave rebellion of Nat Turner here. So with that, Deirdre, let's go back to the studio.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Bill. That was so educational once again.
Right.
Fabulous. I think we do have some questions.
Mhm.
Jim, you want to?
Jim, are you there?
Yep. Bill, I've got 3 or 4 questions here already. One from Julie Codd was Daniel Rasmussen, the researcher from Harvard you spoke of, was he black?
Good question. No, he was white. Yeah, he was white, but very interested in black history. And so he spent a lot of time in the archives, and there were very, very few clues. He was an extraordinary researcher, and he just from tiny tidbits of clues, he went on to discover that whole story, the amazing story of what might have been the largest slave uprising in American history. But he was white. Many of the books written, there have been extraordinary number of books written in the last 4 or 5 years about Black history. It's like a rebirth. And many of those are written by Blacks. Caste, Warmth of Other Suns, Ibram X. Kendi's books, Ta-Nehisi Coates, a lot of extraordinary Black writers making huge inroads right now. Other questions, Jim?
Yeah, Walt Havens asked, when was Hispaniola divided into the 2 countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic?
Oh, good question. From the map, you notice that Hispaniola is split into 2 countries. The larger one is the Dominican Republic. The original name was Santo Domingo, St. Dominic. Also means Holy Sunday. And it was first settled by Christopher Columbus on his second voyage. The town of the capital of Santo Domingo. So it was Spanish. The island was Spanish for 2/3 of it has been from the beginning, from 1493. But the French, when the French started sending out colonists, they noticed that the western third of the island of Hispaniola was very sparsely settled. So they simply moved into Spanish territory and settled what they named Saint Domingue, just the French name for Saint Dominic. And of course, the Spanish could not put up enough resistance to drive the French out. So that's how it became a French country. When it was, that took place in the mid 1700s, it became a separate country.
Okay, and then Sarah Walker has asked, where else in the world was sugar produced at this time, other than in the Caribbean?
Where else in the world was sugar produced? Well, as I mentioned, as early as 10,000 years ago, 7 to 10,000 years ago, it first grew wild in New Guinea, but it took millennia. India was one place. And the Arabs pioneered sugar with their ships from India and then west to Sicily and Spain. So that's Europe started producing sugarcane thanks to the warriors of Muhammad, who conquered all of North Africa and then swept across to Spain. They conquered all of Spain in about 2 years. And it's only in the southern part of Spain where sugarcane is still growing. There are considerable sugar plantations in the south of Spain, in Andalusia. Also in Sicily, there's some grown in the more tropical parts of Sicily. And let's see, in North America, Louisiana is the principal sugar areas. And I won't even mention beet sugar because it's looked down upon as, but you have C&H sugar, which is California and Hawaii. C&H sugar is cane sugar. U&I sugar grown in Utah and Idaho is sugar beets, looked down upon by sugar aficionados. Down in the Tri-Cities, I mentioned this before, I saw a whole railroad car full of sugar beets. It can grow in drier territories like Utah and Idaho, southern Idaho.
Okay, another question here from Cindy Gutierrez says that in Brazil, there was a secret ritual, and I'm going to butcher the name here, capoeira, that has turned into a dance in current form. Did something similar as a secret martial art or secret dance happen amongst American slaves?
Thank you. Two answers. I left out when I talked about the places where sugarcane is grown today. Brazil is a major producer of sugarcane. The coast of Brazil, from Recife in the north down through Bahia, San Salvador, it's fabulous soil and tropical climate for growing sugar. It's one of the other remaining great sugar producers. Now I forgot the rest of the question. Oh yeah, the dance. Yeah, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but in Brazil, for example, most of the slaves came from Angola, straight across the Atlantic, and they brought their language and culture, and they brought the samba music, rhythm and dance. And of course, Brazil is famous for fabulous dances, especially at Mardi Gras. And in Haiti, I mentioned earlier, Diane and I were in Jacmel on the South Coast, and we heard drum beats in the jungles right after sunset. And so we hiked off toward the west, and we found a gathering of Haitians doing voodoo rituals and dancing. It was really astonishing. And I don't know the connection, but it's possible that sugar plantation slaves did develop their own, well, they had their own secret, keeping the culture, the stories and music alive. Maybe there's a connection both in Brazil and in Haiti, with certain dances and voodoo rituals related to their day jobs, which was working in the sugarcane fields.
And then here's a question probably for Deirdre. Tim Spellman asks, where are previous presentations on the Met How at Home website? Where on the website are they located?
They are located in our documents. So if you go up to About Us and then scroll down to Documents, and then it's under Classes. There you have it.
I think there are a couple of 2 or 3 different ways to get to these history classes. One person told me if you just Google Met How at Home, Bill Hottell, it's only a couple of steps to get to it that way also.
Yeah, I think he was talking about the outlines. And I have been putting those in our documents on our website.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
And then finally, you got some comments here, Bill. Kathy says, fascinating lecture, Bill. Thank you. And Frauke says, thanks, Bill, and Met How at Home. And then Julie Codd says that she has heard the term enslaved persons rather than slaves used.
Yes. In virtually all of the recent books and articles in the Atlantic, Black historians and Black writers, correction, African-American writers and authors do not like to use the word slave anymore. And so they have taken up, they've used the term enslaved African-Americans. Enslaved African-Americans. I'm sure you've done any extensive reading, you've seen that also. To me, that's enslaved.
Ridiculous distraction.
Just
Oh,
counted,
well.
I think it's 10 syllables. You say enslaved African Americans. It's 9 syllables. And I often just use the shortcut. Black,
Everybody does.
that's 1 syllable.
Yes.
It's not sensitive. It's not culturally as sensitive, but many of the Blacks, by the way, instead of the term Negro, which was universal for centuries, the ones who started using the term Blacks were Black themselves.
No, they weren't.
They weren't? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bill. I'm just agreeing with you and I need to mute myself.
Oh, I see.
Well, I don't do that so loudly. Sorry about that. I just think all of this is a distraction, but I love hearing your version of all this language. PC hair splitting is a distraction, but if that's what they want to do, okay.